Let's take a look at writing sine and cosine functions. So the steps that we need to take to write trig functions are, we're going to find the midline first, then we're going to figure out the amplitude, which is the number right in the front, and that represents the distance the minimum and the maximum are from the midline. Next, we're going to figure out what the period is, because we know the period is equal to 2 pi divided by the frequency, which is the b value. And then if needed, we'll look at a horizontal shift left or right. And last but not least, we'll write our function. So let's look at two good examples of this. We're going to write the trig function that models the graph below. So first, I'm going to grab my highlighter and I'm going to figure out what the midline is. So you can kind of visually see the middle, and then check and make sure you've got the middle by figuring out your amplitude. So the amplitude is from the midline, how far I go to get to the maximum and the minimum, and they should be equal. So I need to check and make sure the midline's in the right spot. So I see that I go 4 up to get to the maximum from the midline of this graph, and I would also go down 4, but it's just a distance, so amplitude is always a positive number. So I'm going to put that there. The midline is 4, or excuse me, the amplitude is 4. The midline was the one I highlighted in green, and that's just sitting right at the x-axis, so that would just be y equals 0. The period is how long it takes for one cycle to occur. So I usually like to start at 0 because it's easy for me to see where it starts at 0 and goes up and down and comes back up to 0. So I can see that the period for this graph is 4 pi. So I need to say 4 pi equals my period, which is 2 pi over the frequency, which is b. Because period is always 2 pi divided by b. I'm going to write that right there. So that's where I get my formula from. So I got to figure out the b value. So I'm just going to put a 1 underneath the 4 pi and do a quick cross multiply. So 4 pi times b would give me 2 pi. Then I just divide out 4 pi, and I get that my frequency is 2 pi divided by 4 pi. So the pi would cancel out, and it's just 1/2. So now I can write the equation with everything included. So my equation or model of this function would be y equals the amplitude, which is 4. I can also tell my function is positive because it went up from 0 and not down from 0 when it started. So I know it's a positive sine function, and I know it's a sine function because when I highlighted that first cycle, it looked like a S-shaped graph. So I'm going to put 4 was the amplitude. I know it's a sine function. Then the b value was 1/2, so it's sine 1/2 x. And I know it did not shift up or down because my midline was just 0. So that's it for my equation. Let's look at another one. So this one, let's pick out the midline. So again, just visually try to highlight what you think the midline is. And then when you figure out your amplitude, you'll make sure that you've got the right midline. So I can see that from the midline, I go down, it looks like 1, 2.5 would be my amplitude. So let me make sure if I go up, I get to the maximum in the same amount of units. So that's 1, 2, 2.5. So my amplitude was 2.5. Then I can tell the midline is still just at the x-axis, which is y equals 0. And I can pick out the period of the graph. Again, I like to start at 0 and highlight until it comes back to 0, because I can easily see that it starts at 0 and here is where it ends. And then I can quickly pick out my period. So the period is 0.5 pi, and remember, period is always 2 pi divided by the frequency, which helps us figure out the b value because we need that to write our function. So 0.5 pi equals 2 pi divided by b. I'm going to put a 1 underneath the 0.5 pi and do a quick cross multiply to figure it out. So b times 0.5 pi equals 2 pi, and then I need to divide the 0.5 pi. So 2 divided by 1/2 is the same thing as 2 times 2 over 1, because we want to keep it, change it, flip it, or we want to multiply by a reciprocal because we don't like to divide by a fraction. So I get the frequency is equal to 4 pi, and then I can write out my equation. I know it's positive because it's facing up. It looks like a U-shaped graph, but it's facing up instead of down. And therefore, it's also a cosine graph because it looks like a U shape instead of S. So y equals my amplitude, which was 2.5, cosine, and then I've got the b, which was 4 pi. Actually, the pi cancels out, so it's actually just 4. So let me adjust that. 4, and then x. And then I would have a value back here if my graph had shifted up or down. So if it had shifted up or down, the midline would have moved up and down. But in this case, it's just still at 0. So we don't have a value for the d, but that's okay. Let's look at another example. Write a sine function with amplitude of 3, period of 3 pi, and a vertical shift of 4. So they can also just give you some words, and you've got to sort things out. So our amplitude is 3. The period is 3 pi. So let's say 3 pi equals 2 pi over b, which is our frequency. And let's cross multiply again. So 3 pi times b is equal to 2 pi. And then we just need to divide out the 3 pi. So b would equal 2/3. So we got b. We have a, which is 3. And then they said a vertical shift of 4. So we've got everything we need to write it out. And it was a sine function, so that's important. So y equals 3 sine 2/3 x, and then vertical shift of positive 4. So that's it for example 3. Let's try one more example. Write a cosine function with an amplitude of 2 and a reflection, and it also has a period of pi and a vertical shift of 5. So lots of good things going on. So we have a cosine graph, we have an amplitude, so an a value of 2. Let's figure out our frequency based on the period of pi. So the period is always equal to 2 pi divided by our frequency. So pi will equal 2 pi divided by b. And then cross multiply. So pi times b equals 2 pi, and then divide out the pi. So our frequency is just 2. And then they said it has a reflection and a vertical shift of 5. So let's put all that together and write out our function. So y equals a reflection makes it have a negative in the front. We had an amplitude of 2, so let's put that. Cosine graph, a b value of 2, and then x, and a vertical shift of 5. So that would be it for that one. And that's it for all of our examples on writing trig functions.